Hello and welcome. I'm George Crump, lead analyst with Storage Switzerland. Thank you for joining us today. Today we're going to be talking about three big challenges facing backup and recovery operations. One is ransomware. The other is rapid restoration, how to meet the never-ending demand to essentially recover everything instantly. And then, of course, the big one, how to deal with a disaster where you've lost the entire data center. So joining me to help with that conversation, I've invited Sean Darrington. He is the Senior Director of Product Management with StorageCraft. Sean, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, thanks, George. It's great to be here.
So, Sean, before we jump too far into the presentation, why don't you give the folks a little bit of background on yourself and also StorageCraft?
Yeah, so I've been in the storage industry for more than 20 years, dealing a lot of different roles between product management, product marketing at Veritas and Symantec and Exablocks before StorageCraft acquired Exablocks 2 years ago. The StorageCraft's been around for 13 years, really focused on the data protection business for customers to be able to obviously get their data back in the event of a recovery need. StorageCraft acquired Exablocks 2 years ago to really combine the capabilities that they've had over the years from data protection and our scale-out storage. And now we have some unique opportunities. We'll talk a little about that a little bit later, but it's great to be here.
Great. Thanks, Sean. And then for those that don't know me, I'm George Crump, founder and lead analyst of Storage Switzerland. We've been an analyst firm now for going on 13 years. And then prior to that, I was a CTO at a large storage integrator with offices throughout the United States. Did a lot of work in designing disaster recovery strategies for customers. So, Sean, I think between the two of us, we probably have somewhere between 40 and 50 years of experience. So hopefully we can put it to good use today.
Looking forward to it.
So let's kind of hit the big three, and it's kind of interesting. You know, as I was looking at this, of the big three that we're talking about, ransomware, restoration, and disaster recovery, one of them's been with us forever, right? Disaster recovery. But this first one, ransomware, is really not something we've had to deal with a lot, you know, in the early part of certainly our careers, and it does some things to the whole structure that are just kind of different, right? I think the big one there in that first bullet is it attacks all data, including potentially backup data at any time, anywhere. And so in my, you know, in that legacy of 20, 25 years of experience, I never had to worry about protecting the backup data itself. So this is kind of a new wrinkle to the puzzle, right?
It is, and the thing that a lot of organizations have to plan for is that, yes, you can do your daily backups, but the ransomware can actually infect the backup files. And we've actually seen that. There's a major hotel in New York that had, they were using Veeam with OneBlocks as a target and Nimble primary storage for the VDI, and ransomware got literally all three of those things. And so they had to figure out and have a recovery strategy that was not something the CTO had thought about, right? Fortunately, they had us, and they were able to retrieve that information. But as admins, you have to think about not only the primary data and those map network drives being encrypted and corrupted and held for ransom, but now backup files, and that's a different threat vector than a lot of us are used to.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's interesting about ransomware is it seems like it sort of loses its scariness for a little while. It kind of goes dormant, and then all of a sudden there's a news article about somebody else getting attacked. I think that there was a recent somebody in Florida just paid like $600,000 or something like that to get their data back, right? So that's another thing we're seeing, actually, just statistically. I think we're seeing an increase in the fee to get your data back. It used to be, and I use this term very loosely, but it used to be kind of affordable, and now, you know, the numbers are getting pretty high for ransomware attacks, right?
Yeah, they're increasing, as well as depending upon the vertical that you're in. There's other fees associated with, even if you do pay the ransomware, like in the healthcare industry. You know, there's a dollar per record that is exposed and compromised that the hospital or healthcare organization can actually be fined, in addition to needing to pay whatever they need to do for ransomware, and ransomware continues to morph, and it's an ever-changing threat that's no longer about notoriety. It's a business.
Yeah. So I think another thing, and kind of the second bullet, there are areas in the world and in the United States specifically that are kind of geographically safe from, it's not necessarily a big threat for a hurricane or an earthquake or maybe a storm, but ransomware just kind of removes that. No matter where your data center is, if it's connected to the internet, and I would assume that most data centers are, you're ransomware. And again, that's just another fundamental shift in the way we do disaster recovery planning, correct?
It is, and you might be out of the floodplain or out of the earthquake zone, as you said, but there are so many ways that ransomware is morphing, and phishing attacks and URLs coming from different countries, and even state-sponsored attacks. Right? There's a lot of different things that can happen. That it's a different world out there today.
Yeah, and the other thing that kind of tying the two together is you always kind of worked under the assumption that your disaster recovery site is safe, but again, the way ransomware propagates itself, there's just as much chance of your disaster recovery site being infected as and almost at the same time in frequency as your primary site, right?
It is, yeah, and if you have an async replication getting off-site and you've got garbage in on one side that is now encrypted, that's going to be replicated to the alternate site. So you have to think about not only just getting the data off-site, but having some type of air gap or recovery strategy if it is replicating encrypted data from that's been affected by ransomware from site A to site B. These are all different recovery scenarios that now CIOs and CTOs have to plan for.
Yeah, let's drill in a little bit on that air gap thing. We didn't really rehearse this, but I think that becomes really interesting. I mean, the tape vendors, the tape community have always claimed sort of a natural air gap just because of the physical media. But talk about some ways you can get a similar type of air gap with a disk-based solution.
Yeah, so a couple options. I mean, you can have a different sources. Well, the same source replicating to multiple targets, and then essentially pause that replication, move on to another. Create another target where you actually have for the first month, or you have your monthly backups go to share A and share B. It takes your semi-annual and annual, and you can have a replication strategy and a backup strategy that targets different locations that are basically a point in time and static. The other thing from an air gap perspective is, even if that is compromised, do you have the ability to go back to a point in time that is immutable, that is guaranteed to be what it was when it was originally written, and that in essence is still an online replica from the source, but yet that based upon a point in time, that data that was written there is there, and it's insulated from any ransomware or other events that might compromise that primary copy of the data.
Yeah, and we kind of dwell in on ransomware here, but I don't want to call it ransomware, but rogue users or disgruntled employees, especially disgruntled IT guys, can cause similar types of damage, and so that immutability is also critical in those situations as well, right?
Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. So, all right, then I think the big thing that we tend to recommend that people do here, and this covers the gamut from laptops to servers, is really, number one, I think you've got to increase your backup frequency, and increase your backup frequency. By that I mean more data protection events, and you can't assume that certain data sets aren't as important anymore. Like I think again, in that 25 year span, file servers were something you sort of backed up when you could, maybe once a night if you were like really, strict about it. File servers are kind of like a prime target for ransomware. So you got to back those up almost as frequently as you do your mission critical databases, no?
You do, and you have to realize that it only takes one infected user on the network for ransomware to go out and view all the other users that are mapped to that network drive and encrypt everything. And that can happen very quickly, but also, as you alluded to earlier, George, is a lot of times it lays dormant and silent for some period of time for those, maybe the monthly backups to, retire, right? If you've got a 30-day retention, if ransomware is sitting idle for 30 days without, flashing its pay my Bitcoin message, your backups may be completely encrypted as well without knowing it.
Yeah, or they might have what we see commonly as sort of a time release thing, and then so when you go to do your recovery, you're recovering also the malware file, which then triggers the moment it's recovered because the date or whatever has passed, right? So all of those things, I think, and that kind of ties into the second part of that bullet, is your recovery strategy is different now, right? We talked about protecting the backup data itself, but also having to put it really is kind of like a disaster, because you need to be able to recover potentially hundreds of thousands of files or entire volumes very quickly. So it has a lot of the similar aspects to a full-blown disaster, correct?
It does, and all the complications and all the headaches as well, because it's not only the ability to recover the data, but if you recover it, you're recovering encrypted data, right? And so it's not just the ability to get it back, because you've got to get back a clean copy of the data, which is sometimes more difficult.
Yeah, the comparison I like to use is it's kind of like, if you're driving your car and you get it into a wreck, people kind of feel sorry for you and your car's broken and everything. But if you're driving your car and you run out of gas, you just feel like an idiot, right? So, because especially nowadays, because of the things, and it's the same situation here. I mean, it's kind of embarrassing, I think, especially from an IT perspective, to admit that you got hit by ransomware after all the warnings and things that are out there, right? So that won't happen to me sort of mentality can really backfire on you in these situations, right?
It can, and that you've got to, the IT organization's got to train the users to avoid phishing attacks and suspicious activity, and do the regular call to the user, have them reset the password and give it to you over the phone, right? Some simple things like that to train the employees, which aren't always thinking about this from the top of mind, even in the IT organization we are. But users that are just out there day to day doing their job, they're not really thinking about this threat vector.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely. And I think I can't remember the source, but there was a research item out there that said that 63% of ransomware attacks start on an endpoint. Right. So I think that's really important. So I think we've kind of addressed the ransomware thing. We're going to talk specifically about some ways to fix that. But I think the key thing is, number one, make sure your backups themselves are protected. Number two, make sure you're backing up as frequently as possible. And that changes the way, what you look for, I think, technologically speaking, from a backup product. And then also look for ability to also recover very quickly, because, again, this is sort of a disaster type of situation. So, and that kind of ties into the next thing. We've had the concept of recovery time objectives and recovery points objectives probably as when we both started our career, Sean. And I don't know of a situation where they've actually said, oh, you can take longer, it's no big deal this year, right? It's constantly gotten faster and faster. And I think now we're down to even for the kind of the standard, if you will, or business important application, not even the mission critical application, we're typically talking about sub-hour type of recovery efforts, not next day type recovery efforts, right?
Yeah, the RTOs the demand continues to increase, and get that down as short as possible while minimizing the recovery point objective. And you were alluding to earlier, George, and saying that doing nightly backups of file servers was an acceptable practice years ago. Today it's not. I mean, users, they want to do the right mouse Windows previous version. I just made a mistake and want it back instantly. Right, as well as maybe a little bit of an exception on the recovery time. If an entire laptop is infected or hard drive crashes, the IT team probably has a day to get that laptop back, right? But if it's a VM, if it's running the business, yeah, the demands are only increasing to get it back up and running as quickly as possible.
Yeah, and I think and we don't really have a bullet to this, but one of the things that I'm seeing, and I'm sure you've seen it too, is almost every data center I talk to now is experiencing some form of an application explosion in addition to a data capacity explosion, right? Where, again, 20 years ago, there was like 3 applications that really mattered, and really, if you boiled it down, there was like 1. Now there's in a good sized organization, there's 25, 30 applications that are, maybe not mission critical, but business important. And those need, so democratizing rapid recovery, I think really becomes a big issue now. And so it's interesting. I've been making the statement lately that every technology, every backup solution, if you're considering it, needs to have some form of usable, what we call, as an analyst, what we call in-place recovery, where you're instantiating that VM very, very quickly, and it's either recovering data directly from the backup device or it's streaming it somehow. And so I think, what's your thought on that? Do you think that we're to the point where, a rapid recovery type of feature is sort of table stakes for backup solutions today?
I do, and the question is going to be like, and there are some nuances between different vendors' implementation about how to quickly get it back, because there's a software part of it, right? How many recovery points do you have to choose from for what you want to recover, right? That's option 1. Then you've got the medium by which those backups are being stored. Is it hard drive based? Is it all flash? And then the third variable is cost, right? So, costs and consequences are a common theme throughout this entire discussion, George, in that organizations don't have an endless budget to spend on whatever they want to, because you can engineer and design very highly available to get all the VMs back up and running instantly, but that's not something that any organization I know of can afford, right? And so it's a question about how do you define what groups of VMs are the most important, then the next most important, and maybe tertiary kind of thing, and looking at different options for which ones you need to get back as quickly as possible, and then how much it's going to cost, and is that a trade-off that the organization wants to make?
Yeah, and I think that kind of ties into the point I was making earlier, right? When it was just, there was an Oracle database, you could afford to make that investment, and I'll cite your one of your former companies there, Veritas. We could go with, clustered file system and, spend the money on all the HA componentry because there was just one application, so it was worth it to go all in. Now when you might be dealing with 20 or 30 applications, you can't afford to make that kind of investment across 20 or 30 applications, right? You go broke. So I think that really becomes a big challenge. Now, I am going to politely add a 4th thing. I'm going to stretch the limits here, Sean. I'm going to, break the rules a little bit. And I'm going to say that there's a 4th requirement, because the challenge that I see today, because I totally agree now that, and I've been saying this for a while, that hardware now matters on backup targets, right? If you're going to now say my backup solution my backup data might actually be production for a temporary moment in time, that hardware now matters, right? Its availability matters, its performance matters, all those things matter. So I 100% agree with you there. But I'm also going to say that most of the rapid recovery solutions on the market today require some sort of a manual transfer back to primary storage, right? So then another thing, that how do you make that cut over? How do you make that transfer happen? How do you do it without impacting performance or, kind of triggering the wrong version? So it kind of making that transfer more seamless, I think, also becomes a critical component now as well. Do you agree?
Yeah, that's a good 4th point, George, because, thinking about that last step that you're mentioning, you can view that really as the fail back scenario, right? So if you're going to fail over, you got to recover your app, right? So how do I get back to my original state? How do I get that VM back to be running on my production SAN storage that was running originally before the recovery, right? So that fail back step for local recovery is a good thing to call out, but also, we haven't, jumping ahead a little bit, for the site recovery in that disaster, the next point, George, you're going to make is look like, right? We're talking about just a local recovery and failback, but now what does it mean if you've actually got to recover in the cloud or an alternate data center and failback?
Yeah, and I think that's a very easy thing to overlook because, you know, initially you're just so darn happy it worked, right? And probably in some cases shocked. And now the shift back, I have been involved in many disaster recovery tests where they don't actually test failback, it's a huge mistake because while you might not have the time pressure, I have seen where the failback will trigger massive data loss. Like I can recall specifically, I won't name the company, but it was a site-to-site replication software, and when they triggered the failback, it wrote the wrong version back. It was a test, and they ended up going backwards. They actually had to roll tape. This is a while ago. They had to roll tape to get production back to where it should be. Really embarrassing. I fortunately was just auditing, and so all I had to do was take notes and laugh. So I think that kind of hits the rapid. Sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, there's definitely room for improvement in that test, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yes. So I think that really, like I said, I think the key points here is rapid recovery. We want to make sure that it's a table stakes feature, but you also want to kind of really think through. I think the hardware thing now becomes really important, and then I also think the failback function is something we always overlook. I don't want to say that's any more important, but it's something we can even less afford to overlook than we used to. So let's wrap up with disaster recovery. I think we've touched a lot of these, but I think establishing a DR site really comes down to two basic fundamental problems, right? There's a huge cost issue, and in many cases, you have a site sitting there hoping that nothing ever goes wrong, right? Unless you're fortunate enough to have two data centers and you can process them both. And then there's complexity, right? There's complexity in managing the failover. There's complexity in making sure it all works, things like that. So I think if you kind of hinted to this a little bit, Sean, but I think really, and I would say almost any size organization should really consider the concept of cloud-based disaster recovery, or what you'll probably commonly hear, disaster recovery as a service. I know you guys are kind of like on the front lines of that, Sean. What's your thoughts?
Excuse me. Yeah, absolutely. You've got to, going back to the, over the years, the 3-2-1 strategy, right? You've got to have at least one copy of data off-site, and ideally that copy is off-site, but it's readily available. And whether that be an async replication in your other colo, or if you're doing, backups and replicating to the cloud, excuse me, more on an async or even a daily basis. The question is how are you going to recover that system? And depending on the size of the organization, you may have the luxury of a second location where you can stand up, a cold or warm cluster for your VMware environment with production storage, and it's kind of there ready, waiting, and idle. If you're not quite there and you have those top tier, those most important VMs, get those into the cloud, because there are options to actually recover applications in the cloud very quickly, but also thinking about the P2V and the different virtual-to-virtual technologies out there. It may not be, even though you're Hyper-V on-prem, you may be recovering in a non-Hyper-V way in the cloud, and that's a flexible thing to think about. Of whatever application I've got on-prem for those most important, how can I get those back up and running and get my users locally accessing that data again?
Yeah, and I think that really becomes key as we kind of evolve through this process. And one of the things I've tried to do is really educate people that the cloud is not a magic place where unicorns live, right? It's just another data center. And in many cases, it's a pretty well-run data center, but it is just another data center, right? So you have to look at it in that view. And so I've got a couple of things that I list there that I see, frankly, not happening all the time. You've got to have a quality hardware, both from a compute and, again, from a storage standpoint, in the disaster recovery location, because this disaster recovery location may someday be your primary data center for a period of time. And so having that quality hardware, Sean, is really important in that data center, right?
It is, because hopefully you're running for a short amount of time, maybe a couple of days, maybe a week, but depending upon what it is, what kind of event triggered that, it may be longer than that. And it's possible that you could be running a month or so up in the cloud, and you've got to have that consistency for the application services you're delivering. And maybe it's a little bit degraded because it's not full-on production. Maybe it's even better. Who knows? Depends upon where you're coming from, because a lot of the admins I work with, there's aging infrastructure, and who knows what the on-prem performance is like, but you've got to have that reliability to be able to recover the application very quickly, either in your alternate colo or from a cloud provider.
Yeah. What the declaration time, from the time of declaration to the time you have an application running, I think is also a really important thing. We would typically call that recovery time objective. And what frankly concerns me in this area of the market, Sean, is that you'll hear a lot of phrases like push button recovery and things like that, but push button doesn't necessarily mean instant, right? It might be the slowest button in the planet. And so what you need to do is have a very, and if it takes 10 minutes or it takes 15 minutes or it takes 20 minutes, whatever it is, that's fine. Well, unless it breaks your RTO commitment, but you need to have an understanding of what that's going to look like, not assume that you push that button and 2 seconds later you're up and running in somebody else's data center, right?
Yeah, there's a push button, George, but then there's also the orchestration, right? You were talking earlier about
right.
the Oracle databases being the thing that you would protect. Well, now there are so many dependencies between different applications yes. and contingencies about the recovery and in which order are you going to recover each application. That has to be orchestrated and is a tall order, right? Simplifying the orchestration and recovery and minimizing the RTO. That's what organizations should look for.
Yeah, agreed. I think that's a real. If you're looking at the difference typically between the disaster recovery and not, it's the number of servers that are being recovered and the number of interdependencies that are being recovered, right? So, and typically, if the data center hasn't fallen, you're not typically going to, like, for example, recover Active Directory. But if the data center is gone, one of the first things you got to recover is your Active Directory, right? So all that kind of weighs in. And then you kind of touched on this a little bit, Sean, but let's hit it one more time. That failback to primary storage and primary data center also becomes a key aspect as well, right?
Yeah, it does, and especially if you're coming from your own colo and you've got if you're fortunate enough to have high-speed links and dedicated links between the two locations, then that's great. If you're coming from the cloud and you're recovering a multiple multi-terabyte VMs and you're trying to get that back, what does that recovery and what does that failback look like, right? Is it shipping C drives, and is there going to be additional downtime? Is it a failback and just start trickle down from the cloud provider over the network to the customer, to your data center, right? There are a couple of different strategies there, but you've got to figure out what the alternatives are for that failback and test that in your DR plan.
Yeah, exactly. Totally agree. So let's wrap up here with kind of solving these. I think what this really comes down to is rapid, low bandwidth backups, so block level incremental, change block track, those sort of backups I think now become really critical. Rapid recovery is also, again, I think it's a table stakes, but I think the failback part has to become much more automated in today's data center. And then I think finally, a cloud DR, a cloud disaster recovery plan, I think that the scope of organizations that can benefit from that increase. Sean, you had talked about if you're fortunate to have a second site, I would go so far as that second site has to be data center class, which immediately, excludes a whole another tier of organizations. But I even think at the enterprise level now, it's just easier to do that kind of stuff in the cloud. But of course, you want the option to be able to do it on-prem or to a secondary prem as well. So all those sort of work. Now, Sean, one of the reasons I was really glad to have you guys sponsor this webinar is I know that you guys are sort of on the front lines of all this stuff. Why don't you take the people through what you guys are doing in these areas?
Yeah, we've, as I mentioned at the beginning, right, StorageCraft has been around for more than 13 years, and this has been our business, right, making sure that customers can get their data back. What I've been particularly excited about, certainly as part of Exablocks and now part of StorageCraft, is the opportunity to actually deliver something that's unique, where it actually has different options based upon different size customers, different customer requirements, as well as just the way that customers want to progress, right? Any organization is looking at improving or updating their backup infrastructure. It's not a rip and replace, right? Oftentimes, you very rarely find people that are going to do a wholesale change for everything of what you and I just talked about, George, right? They may take on a part of it, right? Maybe let's take on the cloud-based DR, then let's focus on the local recovery later, because that one's good enough for now. And so what we have is options for different types of deployments based upon the size of the company. If you're looking at a converged scale-out storage solution, we certainly have that for managing the unstructured data, but also integrated data protection services. But if you just want to have a software-based solution for, say, a remote office or a small location, you can do that with ShadowSafe, right? That's the same SLA-based data protection that's included in the OneSafe converged solution, but doesn't go along with the physical hardware, right? Flexibility. In these cases with OneSafe and ShadowSafe, we have the opportunity to provide DR as a service for organizations that want to replicate those backups from on-prem into our cloud with very rapid recovery. And this is all based upon OneSafe, which is a unique architecture, right? We are not like the legacy storage, right? We don't deal with LUNs and volumes. We don't have a traditional block store where you have to figure out, is it a 4+2 rate set, and how is it going to be configured? Is it sized correctly for my source and target? And that's actually serving up NFS, SMB, block storage. That's the way it's been done, since you and I started, George. However, what's different is OneSafe is built upon our own distributed object store, right? This is our intellectual property that we started building almost 8 years ago now, and this is something that affords a lot of flexibility to change the way that you think about managing storage, but in the context of today's discussion, really thinking about how you're going to recover that information. The distributed object store, we do any file that's written into us, we look like network attached storage. We look like scale out NFS or SMB. The benefits of object storage, that if you look at the cloud providers, Amazon and GCP and others, right, these are all massive petabyte, exabyte scale object stores. Well, this is something that's actually on premises. It's delivered in an appliance for and works with all the native applications that you have in your data center. It doesn't require a RESTful API. You can plug it in, up and running. Now your users have network drives for file serving, et cetera, for backup target. But all those files are being written into the cluster. They're actually deduplicated, compressed, encrypted at rest, optionally replicated off-site to another cluster. And this microservice architecture gives organizations a lot of flexibility to deploy OneSafe in different ways, as well as over time change and augment how that is going to protect and manage their information. Right? On the left-hand side of this, you can see OneSafe being the primary storage for unstructured data, right? File serving, archiving, digital asset management, engineering CAD/CAM files. All that data that's growing is much more rapidly than the structured data, and also a lot more unwieldy. That's some of the things that a lot of our customers use OneSafe for, is to scale out and add storage over time without disrupting how you actually need to change your application if you're going to grow from 10 terabytes to 50 or from 50 terabytes to 300. You can also use OneSafe for the primary storage for VMware, right? NFS, but also physical servers, depending upon SMB or NFS protocols there. But that same cluster, that same converged capability that we have with OneSafe can be not only primary storage, but also secondary, right? So a lot of companies actually take the mode of, okay, I'm going to think about a pool of storage now, because OneSafe is, think of an object store, a pool of storage that can be used across multiple applications. You don't have to figure out, I'm going to have 2 terabytes for this server and 5 terabytes for this one, and if I don't use everything, now I have underutilized storage, right? Every application has equal access to the storage capacity in a OneSafe cluster. But the converged capability is one of the things that we have that's unique, in that you can use it for primary storage, but also we have integrated data protection services that run on the cluster, and that communicates with VMware and Hyper-V to do backups that are very seamless and depending upon the policies you want to apply, you can have very quick recovery point objectives every 15 minutes or hour or daily based upon your priority within an organization. Applications running in a virtual environment, but also protect all that unstructured data with our continuous data protection. So it's changing the way that you think about managing and storing that information for recovery, and that you're not actually backing up any of that unstructured data anymore, because you can replicate that to another OneSafe offsite in a colo or a data center if you have one. If you want to replicate the backups into our cloud for full DR as a service, that's an option. You can also replicate to AWS just as a storage target, right? So there are multiple options, and all of this is built upon the converged scale-out architecture that we have, that you can start with what you need, and maybe it's everything on the slide, right? Or maybe it's just the primary storage for your unstructured data and getting all those file servers off of VMware and having them protected with snapshots that are taking place every 90 seconds and immutable, right? Or maybe it's just the converged backup, right? Maybe you just want to focus on those VMs initially and then augment that at a later point in time with different use. But this is one of the things that, based upon the software that I've been talking about, it actually runs across multiple OneSafe models. So depending upon the cost and consequence I was alluding to earlier, you can actually have very high performance backup targets with our all-flash OneSafe, right? However, you're talking about 10 to 20 cents per gig per month on this model, where our all-flash is much more affordable than what you'll see from a lot of the other primary flash vendors from Pure or Nimble or others for that virtual environment, where now we have customers that are, because of the affordability of this, it's no longer okay, applications for those top 5% of the VMs that I need to get back very quickly. I'm actually going to put that on all flash, and that's going to be my backup target, right? And maybe I also use that same cluster for other primary storage for high-speed file serving for my engineers that are working on fluid dynamics and modeling, right? But that's a trade-off that you have now between the same software running on an all-flash OneSafe or a capacity-based one, right? Maybe cost is more important than recovery time. So let's go and let's have the recovery be from a OneSafe that's hard drive based, where you can still have that initial recovery with our virtual boot technology in less than a second, but that VM is going to take a little bit longer to recover in the background based upon hard drives versus all flash. So it's a trade-off based upon what the organization wants to do. But this is also one of the things that is unique to our architecture. Because we're object-based, all those snapshots that I was describing are immutable. And when you talk about immutable snapshots, that's one thing. But with OneSafe, you can actually have an immutable backup, right? So whether you're looking at the continuous data protection, taking snapshots every 90 seconds of the unstructured data, that file serving, those CAD/CAM files are being written to the cluster, that's fine, right? Also, the data protection for VMware, right? All of your VMs that are being backed up every 15 minutes to an hour based upon a policy that you want to, those backup files can also be protected with our snapshots. Right? And so now you really have an immutable backup strategy that if ransomware does get into the map network drive and compromise one PC and then take out everybody else, you have an immutable snapshot that cannot be deleted, it cannot be modified by ransomware, that your users can go back to, right? And if it's a backup file and the backup file has been encrypted and compromised with ransomware, if you have snapshots enabled for that, you're going to be able to go back to that prior version of that file, that backup file that is not compromised, and begin to recover that. So it is a different way about thinking about things. And unfortunately, a lot of our customers, I shouldn't say a lot, not the majority, but there are dozens of customers that we have that we know personally. I'm sure there's many others that don't let us know that they've been compromised, but they've been infected, but they've always been able to get back the information because of the immutable snapshots. So even as an admin, you can't delete snapshots that are protected with OneSafe, right? And that's one of the beauties and the benefits of an immutable architecture. And so that's, really quickly, that's one of the things that we focused on is how do you make it as easy as possible to manage the storage and protect that information so that depending upon the recovery scenario, and that fault domain protection that you're looking to recover from, how do we do that and make that as easy as possible with, at the lowest cost possible as well?
Sean, I think that was great. I think if you think about it, you hit all the checkbox, right? The continuous data protection, the immutability of the snapshots, and the cloud, the whole cloud VR functionality that you guys have that really covers all of them. Are you up for a few questions here, Sean? We got a little bit of time left.
Yeah, I see some questions have come in, and we've got some time, so let's address them.
Okay, cool. And if you want to ask a question, you can click on the Ask a Question button and do that. We'll answer it. Also, if you're watching on demand after the event and want to ask a question on the next slide, we'll have some contact information. Don't want you to feel left out of the conversation, so you can get to us that way. So, Sean, let's start with this one. I'm wondering if you have the ability to kind of do a screen share and show this through the interface.
Yeah, it depends on the question, but yeah, that's a possibility.
Okay, cool. Let's see. I have my users on multiple subnets. Can they have access to OneSafe shares? Is that possible?
Yeah, that is possible. So one of the things that we've done with OneSafe is that you have the ability to create multiple network profiles and assign those to different port groups on the OneSafe. And so there are 4 by 10 gig network ports, and in some models there are actually 6, but there are 4 by 10 gig network ports on the hardware. And so what we allow customers to do is actually create multiple network profiles. So if we're a target for VMware, you may want to have that closed non-routable SAN traffic coming to us over NFS, but at the same time, in that multiple use I was describing, they may have different engineers in different groups. And so if you've got different subnets in your organization and you want to have the engineering group or the marketing group or the engineering QA group on a different network, you can create multiple network profiles, and they all have seamless access to the cluster. In fact, there's also virtual IP addresses that you can have, where we recommend doing one virtual IP address per network profile, and that insulates you from any changes going forward. So if you start with a single node and you grow to 3 nodes, or you start with 3 and you go to 5, you don't have to worry about which IP address of the particular node that your users are accessing. For each of your subnets, you create one virtual IP address for each of that, and they all have access to the storage.
Okay, that's great. Let's see. Let's look at the next one here. You mentioned ease of use with the One system. How do you set up remote replication?
Yeah, so One system is one of the things that we focus on to make it as easy as possible. So let me spin this up here quickly. Okay, can you see One system now, George?
Yes, yeah, I can see it. Yep.
Okay, all right. So this is the dashboard for One system, and so as an administrator, I can very quickly see what's important. Right here, I've got errors going on. I've got unprotected machines that are 1 physical, 9 physical, 1 virtual. But to set up replication, it's actually very straightforward, and this is where you don't have to worry about RAID, LUNs, or volumes. Right? You just think about a pool of storage, and so here I have 2 different models of OneSafe, an all-flash and a hard drive, and I'll show that to you in just a minute. But to set up remote replication, to answer the question here, this can be done in literally 3 mouse clicks. So I'm going to just pick a share, and now I'm going to select replicate, right? So now I'm going to replicate this from my source cluster of the G214 to F877, and now I click next. And if I'm on the same network and I don't have any firewall or external ports to go over, I just click finish, and now I'm done. And so in 3 clicks, I've just replicated the NFS Global X2 from one cluster to another. And that could be in the same location. It could be across a different location if you've got a colo. And now I'll start to see my recovery point for that target share that's read-only. So that's as easy as it is.
That's perfect. Okay, cool. Let's see. I guess in the presentation you had mentioned SLA-based data protection policies, which actually is kind of cool. But the listener is asking, what did you mean by that?
Yeah. So a lot of times admins, not all applications are created equal within the portfolio, right? If you take an organization that has 100 apps, not all of them are going to be the most important, clearly. And so how do you take a policy that has, well, let me just show you. Actually, that's a little easier. How do you take a high priority policy that has a retention period of 7 days with 15-minute recovery points? I'm going to keep it for 14 days, and then I'm going to look at the weeklies and monthlies, right? This is going to consume resources, right? Because anytime you do a backup, either whether it be storage resources, networking, or on the server side with the snapshots, there's some implication about things happening that's not running your production application. So you don't always want to do 15-minute recovery points and apply this policy to all of the 100 VMs that you have, but you may want to have different policies based upon, here I've got 6-hour recovery points versus daily recovery points, right? In this case, I'm even going out weekly. So if you have a service level that you're saying to the business, if it goes down and I have to go back to my backup, I can go back to this RPO, and it's going to take me this long to recover it. Well, in this case, I can prioritize those policies, and I can assign those to different virtual machines and make that cost and consequence trade-off.
Huh, okay, that's really cool. Yeah, and I think that's an important thing to rationalize, right? That not everything needs instant recovery, so to speak. So being able to kind of channel that, I think, makes a lot of sense. Let's see. The next question is, how can you apply a policy to different VMs?
Okay, so yeah, there are a couple different ways you can do this. So here, in this view, I can see at a high level what that policy is, right? Not only the name over here on the left, but then what the retention policies are, and then just the protection workflow. So I've got a sense of, okay, this is backing up my systems locally to one safe, but I'm actually replicating that off-site to 2 different locations. Here I'm only replicating to 1, here I'm not replicating off-site. So let's go in and actually, you can assign a protection policy to 1 or multiple VMs simply by selecting the policy that you just created. And there's a couple different workflows, but I'm going to show this one here because it's a little bit easier to get into. With this protection policy, I can search for, I'm going to take all my CentOS, right? So all these VMs that I have the name of CentOS on, or you can search by your host if you want to. I can simply select which policies I want to, which VMs I want to protect, excuse me. You can see which policy is currently assigned, and if I mouse over that, I've got a quick pop-up of, I don't remember exactly what medium policy was. Well, now you've got an idea, right? It tells you exactly what it is. It tells you its replication offsite to another SMB, share, etc. So from here, I can literally just select and assign a policy. And now these are the 3 policies that I have created. And now I can choose any one of these 3. This is what's currently applied, but I can also say, nope, let's drop it down to low, and then I click Save, and you're done. I'm actually not going to change this policy in this environment, but that's how you assign a policy to a VM that has one assigned, or if it has no policy assigned, you would see that as well.
Okay. Yeah. So that's really quick. It probably you don't want to change the policy because you don't want to screw up somebody else's environment up. I get that. Let's see. So we got that one, and then I guess the final question we got in the queue here, Sean, is how long does it take to recover a 2 terabyte virtual machine?
That's probably, George, that reminds me of how long does it take me to replicate my Oracle database, right?
Right, yes,
yes. Always, it depends, right? Well, in this case, it's actually, it doesn't depend. We can actually recover any sized VM in less than a second. And when I say recover any size VM, that VM will be booting from a recovery point in less than a second. Now, after it's booting up, that VM is running on the host that you select the target for, and that is going to actually be running, and your application's up and running. Your users can begin to use it. And this is our virtual boot and patents that we have that I've spoken a little bit about before. Enables that application to begin booting any size in less than a second. Now, the background process, as that application is using the data, safe as a target, right, and written back to the primary storage for VMware that the VM was originally hosted on. That process is going to take time, depending on if it's a hard drive or all flash, right? That trade-off I was talking about. But from recovering that VM, that application is up and running as soon as it's done booting, right? And then from there, all the data is moved transparently from the backup target, OneSafe, to the primary storage. And then when that's done, the VM that you just recovered doesn't know that anything has changed. There's no second step for a storage vMotion to move that data, that 2 terabytes, from location A to location B again. And that's the difference between some of the implementations for instant recovery that I was talking about before, in that there's no failback, there's no extra vMotions failback step that's necessary with OneSafe. As well as if this is replicating from the cloud. So here, let me just show you. So this is we're going to do a virtual boot recovery, right? So I just went in and I found this machine, CentOS 07, and now I'm going to choose my recovery point, right? So I'm going to go ahead and choose this recovery point, and let me go back. Showing this is always going to pull the optimal location, right? So this is the most current. You're going to have the different recovery points, but it's going to look for the local storage to where you're going to recover. If this is off-site in the cloud, you'll see different options here for recovering in the cloud. Having said that, I'm just going to take the current recovery point, and now I'm going to do an instant restore with virtual boot. And here, change the name of the VM, right, because this is the recovery VM, not the original VM, and then which host I want to recover it to. I'm going to put it on the primary, CPU memory. I'm going to make it live. Now I click next. And as soon as I do that, there's a confirmation and that VM begins to boot up. And then from there, you're done. So whether you're recovering locally or whether you're recovering in the cloud, that fail-back scenario, those fail-back steps, you can use that cloud-based DR to do a virtual boot, recover back to your on-prem storage. So in this case, George, it wasn't an it depends question for the 2 terabyte VM. It's less than a second.
Okay, well, that's good. And then I really like the fact that the failback is, if you will, integrated. I think that's an area that really trips people up. So having that component sort of integrated or doing a streaming type of recovery, I think that's a pretty unique benefit. So good job there. All right, well, Sean, that brings us really to the top of the hour and the end of the presentation. We've cleared the questions queue. Again, if you'll flip that back to me out of screen share mode, Sean. And then thank you, got it. So what I want to do is put up the contact information for the two companies. Everything's right there for you. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. Probably the best way is the Twitter handles. Just reference that you saw the webinar and you had a question. I also want to point out that we have some attachments and links. There's a ebook that we wrote recently that'll be of some value. And then also there's some various, kind of deeper dive sort of technical documents in there that you guys can take a look at and, use whichever ones you see fit. And then if you're watching on demand and you have a question, feel free to reach out to us at any of those addresses. So Sean, thanks very much for helping us out on the webinar today.
Yeah, you're welcome. Thanks, George. I enjoyed it.
No problem. And then I want to thank all of you for joining us today. If you found this webinar valuable, I'd appreciate if you would forward the link to a friend or a colleague. The same link that you use to get to the live event will also trigger and work for the on-demand event, but please go ahead and do that. I'm sure they'd rather get an email from you than from me. So for now, though, for Sean Darrington, I'm George Crump, lead analyst with Storage Switzerland. Thank you and have a good day.